Hello. Today we're going to have, and I'm sure, beautiful discussion about a question that we have here. That is modern education standing up to the task of raising awareness on climate action and preparing youth for the future. Here we have Professor Fernando M. Reimers, and he is the founder, foundation professor of the practice of international education and director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative, and also of the International Education Policies Master's Program at Harvard University. He's also an expert in the field of global education. His research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in 21st century. In addition, he's a member of UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education. So welcome, Professor, and we're
I'm,
glad to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be with you and to participate in this conversation.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a series of questions, and we'd love to have your input on them. So our first question is about your book, actually, Education and Climate Change. So in your book, you talked about the role of universities in educating climate change. However, do you think universities are the ideal starting point for educating the young generation?
It's a great question. This book, it's an open access book, can be freely downloaded by anyone who's interested. I'll tell you why I wrote that book. I am a member of something called the Harvard Climate Change Initiative. And this is a group of professors in the university interested in that topic. And I have learned in that group that most members of that group are scientists, in the physical scientists. I believe there aren't other colleagues from the School of Education. And so I concluded from that one of the reasons the climate change crisis is the most significant crisis in our time is because the people who most deeply understand that crisis talk mostly to themselves. And we need to find avenues to educate the entire population of the world, the full 8 billion people, not only to understand this crisis and not only to care about it, but to have the skills to adapt to mitigate, and to revert this crisis. Now, that is a very tall order indeed. So how do we do that? We need to engage every educational institution, from preschools to elementary schools, to secondary schools, to university, to lifelong learning, in the task of helping people develop those capabilities, which go well beyond understanding the science of climate change. Now, I think universities are wonderful levers to build that learning ecosystem. So what we did in this book is I engaged my graduate students in testing a very simple approach. And the approach was partner with an existing educational institution, an elementary school, a secondary school, an organization of non-formal learning for adults. Identify in what way is climate change impacting that population. Identify what are the opportunities to adapt to, mitigate, and revert climate change, and develop with them a curriculum that is effective in developing the full breadth. Then test that curriculum, teach it, evaluate it, and then let's share that with the public. Now, my hope with this book is not that this book alone is going to transform what we need for climate change. My hope is that this book will inspire faculty members in each of the 28,000 universities we have around the world to begin to work with their colleagues in the sciences, with their students, in partnering with other institutions. I think if we can do that, universities will be able to contribute to alleviate this crisis, not because this is educating university students, which it is, but because it is engaging university students and faculty in service and in partnership with teachers at all other levels of education. Frankly, I cannot think of another way to do this. I cannot think of another way to bring to scale at the speed that is necessary a transformation, a creation of an ecosystem that can help educate people with the necessary skills so we tackle this, which is an existential crisis for humanity.
Perfect. Amazing, amazing, Professor. This leads us kind of to the next question. So, if let's say climate change was taught in school, um, would it be a subject of its own, or should it be included in different subjects such as STEM, let's say?
That is an excellent question. So, in the first chapter of this book, I review about 100 studies that evaluate the effectiveness of climate change education. And sadly, what those evaluations show is that most of those programs are not effective, are not sufficiently effective in equipping students with the full range of dispositions that they need to tackle climate change. In fact, some of them are counterproductive. They teach students understanding of climate change, but they actually disempower them. They make them very cynical about their own possibilities of tackling this crisis. So they resign themselves to the fact that we are destroying life on the planet. Now, there are few studies that show very different results. And for the most part, they are studies that combine teaching, deep teaching of the science of climate change with providing students with opportunities for them to engage in being part of the solution. It's only when you do both things that you develop not only deep knowledge, but the disposition, the desire, the attitude to actually make a difference and the skills to make a difference. So in response to your question, how do we in every educational institution provide students the opportunity to do both? I think ideally, you create a course that impacts all students, that becomes the anchor, a course that integrates the science of climate change with engagement in ways for students to participate in adaptation, mitigation, reversal. And this course connects to the disciplines, So the way this process could go, say in a high school, is you would have a dedicated group of students, of faculty, a leadership team, who would first study deeply what are the challenges of climate change, and who would then translate that into a framework of competencies that a graduate of that high school should have in order to be able to understand, adapt, mitigate, and revert climate change. With that framework, they would then design a course that would help build those capacities, and they would engage their colleagues in other departments so that in every department, different faculty align with their own teaching to contribute to develop components of this integrated set of competencies. So I think the answer to your question, should we have a separate course or should we integrate it, is we should do both. But what that means is we need to think about a process of change management in the school in order to do that. And this is entirely doable. I have, for the last several years, been working with my colleagues in the development of a program of school transformation aligned with the SDGs. And we have done this now in thousands of schools. We have two books, two curricula that we have developed. One is called the World Course, Empowering Global Citizens. And the other one is Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons. And those two provide a protocol, a simple process to equip a leadership team in a school to do what I have just described.
Amazing, amazing, Professor. So now that let's say the young generation is educated, and as you know, the average national climate change literacy rate in Africa is around 37%, which is far lower than in Europe and North America, which is generally around 80%. So how can we educate the older generation so that climate change literacy not only increase within the young generation, but in a community as a whole?
Yeah, that is a very, very important question. As I mentioned at the outset, the challenge of educating people for climate change is not only the challenge of educating those who are in school, but it's a challenge of educating everybody, of educating certainly the teachers, the university professors, the people who work in different professions, the people who have not gone to university, the adults. And I think what that requires is mapping. That's why I think what we need is the creation of an ecosystem of education for climate change. And I believe that universities are well positioned to be the anchor of that ecosystem, to mobilize that ecosystem. Now, that ecosystem includes organizations that educate adults, organizations that educate students who have abandoned school, who have dropped out of school, that educate people in the workplace, that educate essentially everybody. And in this book of the various projects that my graduate students design, we have curricula that are taught in schools, but we also have, for example, a curriculum that is taught by a non-formal organization to very vulnerable students who actually only went to school for a few years in Pakistan. And basically, but these people who are farmers, whose livelihood is totally impacted by the salinization of the land that they work, also need to be educated to adapt to climate change in their case. And so that organization, in partnership with my students, ask, what are the competencies that these young people who have dropped out of school need, and how do we effectively help them gain those competencies? Similarly, another one of the projects in that book is a project that worked with workers in the informal sector in Haiti who are impacted by the hurricanes and the growing number of hurricanes product of climate change. And in that case, they identified a delivery channel through radio education to deliver very specific messages to these people involved in trade, in simple trades, in the informal economy, to help them develop the skills to organize their work so that it wouldn't be completely devastated by these hurricanes. So I certainly want to emphasize that the challenge of education is not only a challenge of educating the people who are currently enrolled in educational institutions, but it's also the challenge of creating delivery channels to educate everyone. Now, to be honest, I think that existing educational institutions, in fact, universities, need to ask themselves the question, how many of our students, how many graduates of our universities are educated on climate change? Not only do they have a basic awareness of it, but do they understand it deeply? Do they understand how it is impacting our community? Do they care enough about it to be motivated to do what is within their reach to make a difference? And do they have the skills? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the competencies to do something about it? When you ask many people, they have the most superficial, the most shallow understanding. They think that if they just recycle their trash, or if they use their own cups as opposed to water bottles, they're making a contribution. And of course, that's a meager contribution. But if that's all we do, we are not going to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need to do a lot more than that. We need to reimagine work. We need to reimagine how we transport ourselves. We need to reimagine the very way in which societies are organized. And I think that is a task in which professionals, university graduates, can play a very important role. But I would say that at the moment, if you did an honest audit of the graduates of the 28,000 universities in the world, only a very small percentage of them are gaining the right skills. So I do think that, to go back to your question, universities are a wonderful place to begin, A, because they're doing an awful job at the moment in preparing people for that, and B, because they have more capacity than the rest of the education ecosystem to not only educate their students, but to be of service, to support the rest of all these organizations in building this ecosystem that can educate everyone.
I can't agree more with you, Professor. Now, I just want to look at it from, let's say, a bigger point of view. So that no wonder diversity in STEM fields is key to stopping climate change. However, according to multiple surveys, many students choose not to study these fields or even drop out after a year or two. So why do you think this is happening, and how can we tackle it? How can we solve it?
It's a very important question. We know from educational research that the most transformative education, the most empowering education, is the education that is both authentic and relevant. What does authentic mean? That the student can understand the connection between what they are learning and the life they experience outside the school, the problems that they see outside the school. What does relevant mean? That what they're learning matters to things that the students value. When you manage to engage students in learning experiences that they can connect with, to things that are valuable to them, and to problems that they perceive important, you've worked the magic. It's a different student. You have a student that is intrinsically motivated and so on. But we know that most education is not like that. And that is why my work over the last decade has been precisely about how do we build that kind of curriculum? How do we align educational institutions with those problems? And I think one of the ways to do that is you begin with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and not teach the SDGs. That's very easy to do. To develop awareness of the SDGs, it doesn't do anything. You need to translate these SDGs. You need to do the hard work of asking yourself, in order to have a world without poverty, what is it that students need to know, be able to do, and care about? And the same for each of the 17 goals. And that's hard work, but it's totally doable work. That's what I did with my colleagues when we took the SDGs and we translated them into a framework of 180 competencies, both cognitive skills, interpersonal skills, and intrapersonal skills, the ability to know yourself and to manage yourself. And out of that framework, we map backward 350 units of transformational experiences, mostly project-based learning, designed to help students experience an education that is both authentic and relevant. And little by little, take the student from being a total novice on these matters to have these deep expertise and to have the capacity to be a change agent. The emphasis of that curriculum is in cultivating the agency of students. For those of you interested in learning more about that, this book, which is also an open access book, freely downloadable, summarizes that work. But as I mentioned, I've now seen thousands of schools in many different countries do that. So this is not rocket science, what I am suggesting. What it requires is that we reimagine education. And this is a wonderful opportunity to do that. UNESCO has just released a report called Reimagining the Future of Education, a new social contract of education. It's the product of an international commission that has spent the last 3 years developing that. Throughout its history, UNESCO has only 3 times put together a commission to produce a report on the futures of education. The first report was published in 1972. The second report was published in 1996. This is the third report. One of the very important ways in which this report is different is, number one, the framing of this report takes the issue of climate change as core, as foundational to the urgency to reimagine the future of education, much more than any previous report. Number two, unlike the 2 previous reports, this report is framed to an invitation not only to educators, not only to ministers of education, to students, to everybody, to those who are with us in this week, in Sustainability Week. It's an invitation to co-construct the actual strategies to translate the ideas in this report into a change culture of education in all education institutions. So I invite you all to read this report and to ask yourselves, what do these ideas mean for me? What can I do within my sphere of action to contribute to developing a new social contract of education, to contribute to reimagine educational institutions within my sphere of influence? We don't need anyone to do anything extraordinary. Just do what is within your reach and be part of a global social movement that can help us transform the phenomenal architecture of education that has been built over the last decades, so it actually succeeds at empowering every learner with the skills that they need, not only to improve their own circumstances, not only to find their voice, not only to have agency, to see themselves as change makers, but with the skills to collaborate with others in bringing about a world that is more inclusive and more sustainable.
That is an amazing way to look at it, Professor. I really loved your answer here. One last question, which I loved, to be honest. In chapter 7, section 2 in your book, Education and Climate Change, You talked about learning climate change by doing and engaging the students, which, to be honest, I thought was brilliant. And how, and I quote, they can tackle a large, complex challenge by breaking it into smaller chunks. From your experience, can you give us an advice on how can we take this to schools with young students, let's say?
Absolutely. Let me give you a concrete example, but let me first explain that one of the long-standing challenges in education is the challenge of how to connect conceptual knowledge, deep understanding of the facts of the world, with procedural knowledge, the skills to actually use that knowledge to produce change. We do know that pedagogies such as project-based learning are especially effective in helping people gain those two things. And when students have experience, and when they learn from reflecting on their experience, they learn much more deeply than if they study a book, if they listen to a lecture, if they watch a good film or a simulation. And so that's why the curriculum I have developed is all project-based learning. But it's very important that experience is also connected to opportunities to develop deep knowledge. So I'm not suggesting simply that schools engage students in shallow activism, not grounded in a deep understanding of the science. I think if we do that, you produce ill-informed activists, people who are not strategic in their actions, people who have good intentions and who do things that at the end of the day may not matter very much. That's why, for example, this movement to get people to recycling or to cleaning the parks and so on is well-intentioned and is good. But we need just as much people with the skills to develop safe nuclear technologies that get nuclear energy, that can help us replace this heavy dependence on fossil fuels that we know is extremely harmful to climate change. We need people with the skills to develop nanoparticles that can be placed in the atmosphere to deflect the rays of the sun. And that is about deep science. That is about deep knowledge of physics, of chemistry, and engineering to do that. And so what we need in education then is to provide students a sequence of experience, a well-organized, well-structured progression that will take students little by little from experiences that are within their reach, that may begin by developing the curiosity about the world, the exploration about the world, the understanding about the world, to actually gaining the skills where they see themselves deeply invested in understanding the chemistry of climate change, in understanding the physics, in understanding how engineering can help you. I'll give you an example of this. Several years ago, Bill Gates, who, as you know, is very interested in climate change, realized that one of the big challenges for climate change is how do we dispose of human waste? And, in many countries, the way in which you dispose of human waste is actually very unsanitary. It is done in a way that is extremely harmful to the environment. Now, one of the technologies that we have to dispose of human waste are toilets. But it turns out toilets, the way we know them, are extremely unsustainable. The amount of water that they require to function, if we were to provide each of the 8 billion humans in the world with a toilet, we would be causing extreme harm to the earth. So we need a new kind of toilet. That's an engineering task. So at the beginning, Bill Gates approached a number of universities, some of the best universities in the world. He said, do you want to work with me? We need to invent a new toilet. And you know what? Many of those universities turned him down. They were not interested, or they thought they didn't have the skills, which is very sad. Because if you think about this, what this was trying to produce was a very sustainable way to tackle one of the not so small components of climate change. How do we dispose of human waste? I mean, eventually he's become involved in that and he's gotten some good universities and university students. But to go back to your question, that's what our education institutions need to produce. People with the imagination of Bill Gates, people with the depth of understanding that can translate this big challenge and say, okay, I know one of the drivers is the disposal of human waste. How do I invent a new way to do that? I know one of the drivers is how how the light goes through the atmosphere and actually hits the earth. Is there a way to deflect that? And there's some very cool experiments going on. We don't yet know the results of that, of creating particles that can be placed in the atmosphere that would deflect some of those race. So I think educational institutions need to produce not only people who care about climate change and who have the inclination to do something, but who don't have the depth of expertise to actually be useful in a strategic way. Nor should they just produce people who are deeply knowledgeable of the science, but who don't have the procedural knowledge, the capacity, or the desire to be part of the solution. We need to produce both. And the way to produce both is to integrate. I think one way to do this is engineering education, is to create engineering challenges and effective education in schools that little by little take children from kindergarten all the way to university with the capacities of being inventors, of being creators, as well as people who are deeply concerned about these challenges and deeply committed themselves to being part of the solution. So if I could give you an example, an example of a program to do just that. Some former students of mine created a program in Mexico to empower with these skills students in very poor communities. And the way in which they did it was to basically provide students an experience, a project-based experience where they identified a real problem in the world and they found a solution to the problem. And so they did that. I did an evaluation, a rigorous evaluation of the impact of that. It's amazing what these former students were able to produce. And I'll give you just one example. So here's a community in a very rural place, very indigenous people, where when they reach the age of 14, most girls drop out of school. And of course, from the point of view of sustainability, that's a terrible thing because we need the talent of both men and women. And so they engage the students themselves in this high school in an analysis of why are the girls dropping out. And they found that the root cause of this problem was that there was no water in the school. The lavatories had no water. And they said, if you're a girl and you begin to menstruate, you don't want to come to a school where you cannot use the toilet. And so you stay home. And you stay home the days when you have your period. And if you miss school 3 to 5 days a month, every month, you're not going to be able to pass the grade to be promoted. So you drop out of school. So they said, how can we solve the problem? And they engaged the student in a generation of alternatives. And they realized that a few houses down from the school, there was a woman who had a water well in her house. So they went to talk to this lady. They said, can we have access to the water in your well an hour a day? She said, yeah, but you're going to have to find a way to transport the water. So they found a mechanism with a small water pump, with some hoses. But that experience that engaged students in a very poor community in the process of identifying an important challenge. Actually, I remember interviewing those students and asking them, why did you choose this problem among all the problems you could have chosen? Their answer was amazing. They said, because we know that education is very good for you. And we think it's very unfair that the girls have to stop their education simply because the lavatories don't function. So that is a phenomenal lesson in ethics, in commitment to the common good, that the students, including the boys who didn't have this problem themselves, understood that they had to be part of the solution to a problem that was everybody's problem. So I think one of the ways in which we can educate people for climate change at every stage of their education is creating opportunities like these, creating opportunities for students to connect their understanding of the problems in their communities to what they're studying in school, and to then translate that into generating solutions that they can themselves test and evaluate and learn from that.
Beautiful, beautiful, Professor. That was a really interesting story that we can all learn from, to be honest. I'm afraid, Professor, that's our time. I think that's our time. And I seriously can't thank you enough for this fruitful discussion. It was really an eye-opener to all of us here. So thank you very much, Professor.
It was my pleasure. I have great hopes that all the participants in this forum will actually seriously look at the challenges that we face and look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, am I going to be an observer of the biggest crisis humanity faces, or am I going to be part of the solution? And what can I do, not in the future, not when I grow up, tomorrow? What can I do that is serious, that demonstrates strategy, deep understanding, and that actually makes a difference. And my hope is that this week will actually help people, empower people with the commitment and the skills to make a difference. Thank you.
Hopefully, Professor. Thank you very much.